Well, we're so glad to see each of you here tonight, and I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to be with you and to study with you tonight again. We've started on a theme about small things, and our general purpose is to show that you do not have to be big in the eyes of the world to be important in the eyes of God. That even small things, when they're put into the service of the Lord, they become very significant and important, not only to us, but to those round about us. Last week we began by looking at several instances, demonstrations of this from New Testament records. We'll not take our time to review those, but we'll go forward tonight turning into the Old Testament for our first illustration of the importance and the significance of small things, because the Lord has told us, do not despise the day of small things. Now, that which I want us to consider, you are very familiar with it. You've heard many sermons from it, profitable lessons. And it has to do with an event that is recorded for us in 2 Kings chapter 5, and about the man named Naaman. There are a number of instances and people and situations in this account that show how small things and put together in the proper order are very important, and they have a great bearing upon the lives of so many people round about, and even upon us even yet today. Now in 2 Kings chapter 5, we read about this man Naaman. Naaman was a captain in the Syrian army. The Syrians and the Israelites were habitual and continual enemies, one with the other. So the fact that there was even some association here in this particular chapter is rather remarkable. But Naaman, he was an important person, but he had leprosy. And that was a dread disease then and now. I understand that there are certain kinds of leprosy for which men have been able to discover some cure, but there are still certain kinds of leprosy for which there is no cure even yet. And there was not any medical cure for leprosy at the time of Naaman. Well, we're introduced to a little Israelite maid. Her name is not even given. She had been taken captive during one of the raids of Syria against the people of Israel, and she was now in the service of Naaman's wife. She must have been a very high-quality young lady. At least she had a concern for her master, and she suggested to him that there was a prophet over in the land of Israel, that if he would go to that prophet being a prophet of God, he could secure a cure for that disease. Well, this came to the attention of the king of Syria, and so the king of Syria sent him to the king of Israel. Now, of course, the little Israelite maid said, he's to go to the prophet of God. But now we've got the important man Naaman, and we've got the important man king of Syria, and you've got the important man king of Israel. And so with the letter from the king of Syria, Naaman went to the king of Israel and says, cure this man of the disease. Well, this was quite disturbing to the king of Israel, wasn't it? He said, what's he talking about? I don't have the ability to do this. This man is trying to provoke some kind of conflict between me and him, so that he would have an excuse maybe to come against me. And he was quite disturbed about it. And then we're introduced to another very important person in this entire episode, and that's the prophet of God, the prophet Elisha. And Elisha heard about how disturbed the king of Israel was. And he says, send that man down here to me, and I'll take care of it. And so he did. And Naaman came to the residence of the prophet Elisha. We're next introduced to a person who is a rather, well, according to the rank of men, a rather minor character. He does play a role in this scenario here, and his name is given. His name is Gehazi. Now, Gehazi is, I don't know whether his name is given in this chapter or in another chapter, but anyway, it's given, and he is named Gehazi. And Gehazi was the servant of Elisha. And when Naaman came to the doorway of Elisha's residence, Elisha sent Gehazi out to see Naaman, with the instructions of what he was to do in order to be cured of leprosy. He was to go to the Jordan River. He was to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River, and he would be healed. Well, when Naaman saw the servant come to him, that might have rubbed him a little bit raw, because he's used to being sort of met with all of the most important people, not a servant. But when he heard the instructions, he was, well, I don't think the word infuriated is too strong. He was quite upset about it. You see, Naaman had made a mistake. He had first gone to the wrong man by going to the king, and now he made the mistake of he had already figured out in his mind how this thing was going to work. You know, people are like that in dealing with God, even in our own time. They've already figured out how God's going to heal them and save them and bless them. And sometimes they just don't have it right, do they? And Naaman, when he heard this, he said, behold, I thought that he would come out here and wave his hand over the place and I would be healed. The trouble with Naaman was he thought, but he didn't really think clearly. It wasn't left up to him to think how this was going to work. It was up to him to follow the directions that were given to him. And the same thing is true with me and you and everybody, even in our own time. It's not up to us to work out our own salvation and our own plan of salvation and expect God to conform himself to do what we figure that ought to be done. It's our responsibility simply to give heed to the instructions of God and do what he says. Well, he was so upset, he said, we've got better rivers than Jordan back over there in the land of Syria. And he named a couple of them. And I don't doubt that the rivers, they may have been purer rivers and more beautiful rivers and better rivers as far as Naaman was concerned. He said, why can't I go there and wash and be clean? Well, that was because that wasn't God's instructions. That's why he couldn't go there and wash and be clean. He was told to go to Jordan. And he was so angry, he was going on back home and not do what God told him to do. Well, then we're introduced to another rather small, insignificant kind of person that doesn't get the headlines of the world. And that was a servant of Naaman. And this man, I think he was rather bold. And I think he must have been a man that had some care and concern for Naaman. He was bold in that he crossed his master just a little bit right here, didn't he? When he said, now, Naaman, master, if he had told you to do some great thing, you would have done it. I don't doubt that Naaman would have. You know, people like to do things to get the name in the headlines. In fact, people like to do things sometimes to even get the name in the church bulletin. Just any sort of notoriety that they could do. You would have done it if he had told you to do some great thing. But what he was told to do was, folks, it was a small thing. How big a deal is it to go dip yourself 7 times in a river? Now, that may be peculiar. It was peculiar. It was different. It was not the normal diagnosis and prescription from the doctor. But this is nothing difficult about this. And so he persuaded Naaman, why don't you just do what God said and be healed? And so the man must have been rather persuasive. And so Naaman went to the Jordan River. He dipped 7 times, and when he came up, his flesh was like that of a little child. He was perfectly healed. And you know what he said? He didn't say, wow, this is some water here. This is a great river. He didn't say that. He said, whoa, this prophet, he really knows what he did. He didn't say that. Now I know that there is no God in all the world but in Israel. He was wise enough to give credit where credit belonged. In fact, he went back to Elisha and he wanted to give Elisha some gifts, and we're going to terminate the story right there. And look at some of the small, insignificant things that took place in this whole account. What about the little maid? You know, if it hadn't been for the little maid, this story would have ended with the 2nd verse. It never would have gotten to the Jordan River, would it? It never would have heard about it. She was a most important cog in all of this. She was the one that started it. Her name is not even given. She's just a captive servant. But who would dare say that she was not significant and important to Naaman, to Elisha, to the Lord, to everybody around about? Small, but big in the eyes of God, don't you think? And then we mentioned Gehazi. Gehazi was just a servant. But what if he had not done what Elisha told him to do? What if he had not given the instructions and given them clearly to where Naaman could follow through with them? Would it ever, Naaman, been able to go back home a cured and healed man if Gehazi had not done his job? Why, Gehazi was so important in all this. Now, he wasn't a king. He wasn't a captain in the army. He wasn't a prophet. He was just a servant. But he did what was important. And then we think about the instruction, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. What a simple task that was. But the servant of Naaman that persuaded him. I think in one way, he is a real hero. He really kept things alive and kept them going. And if he had not been there, and if he had not been wise, and if he had not been caring, and if he had not been persuasive, why, we wouldn't have this example from Naaman. And there's so many examples in this account that are applicable to us and our service and obedience to God. He's performed his role with great precision, and he is certainly to be congratulated for having done it in a marvelous way. But I want to ask you this. He was told to dip 7 times in the Jordan River. By the way, the Hebrew word dipped, when it's translated from the Hebrew into the Greek, is the word from baptizo. He was submerged. He submerged himself 7 times in the Jordan River. Okay, I raise this question. How important was that 7th dip? That was very important, wasn't it? Among the dips. Yeah, that was a very important dip. I read an article one time from a nut. He wrote and said, what if Naaman had only dipped 6 times and he counted wrong? And would God had allowed him to still have leprosy? And I thought, you know, I believe Naaman had more sense than this author. Naaman, if he had only dipped 6 times, he would have realized he still had leprosy. He wouldn't have had to go read an article from a liberal. You know, liberals are always trying to find some way where man can just dismiss what God teaches us to do. Why do they want to do that? The Lord He's the author of salvation to them that obey Him, not to them that concoct their own ways or make God's commands optional. No, if he had only dipped 6 times, he'd have gone home and died a leper. But he dipped 7 times. But how important was that 7th one? Well, that's when you saw the result, wasn't it? Raise this question. How important was dip number 5? You never would have gotten 7 if you hadn't had 5. Or dip number 3. Or number 3, if we personalize these dips, he said, I'm just the 3rd dip. I'm not much. Nothing happened when I dipped the 3rd time. And the 5th dip said, no, I'm probably bigger than you are, but nothing happened when I dipped. When he dipped the 5th time, and the 7th one could have said, I'm the only one that really got. But he'd been wrong. He never would have shown up at all if it hadn't been number 3 or number 5, and all the others proceeded. Every one of them were important, were they not? Why? Because that's what God told him to do. That's why every one of them were important. That's why all these people were important. Because they did what they could do to help bring about this situation. To my mind, the story of Naaman is a very convincing lesson on the necessity of obedience to God. I recall on one occasion I tried to preach a sermon about Naaman, did the best I could about it, and evidently that particular day I did all right. A man came forward. He wanted to be baptized. As we went into the baptistry, he turned to me and he said, you know, that story about that man convinced me you need to preach that more often. Well, I've preached it time or two. I don't know that I've ever had as much blessing and joy as I had on that particular occasion from it. But this is an example of do what God says and God will bless you. There's the benefit for us today. Plus the fact, regardless of who you are, how big or small you think you are, only following God's way is what matters. Whether you're a king or whether you're just a little maid, whether you're just a servant, whether you're just a dip, you're important in the sight of God. Anybody have any comments or questions you'd like to raise about Naaman in our study about small things? Okay. I think that's so familiar to us anyway. I want us to look now into 1 Kings chapter 21. 1 Kings chapter 21. I hope I'll have time to cover this tonight. In 1 Kings chapter 21, Ahab was the king in northern Israel with his mean old wife Jezebel. And Ahab had a piece of property that bordered upon a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth. Ahab wanted that vineyard. Well, there's nothing wrong with him wanting it. And he offered to buy it. Naboth didn't want to sell. He said, I'll give you one just as good or better. And Naboth said, no, this is my family inheritance. I don't want to turn loose of it. I want to hold to it. And this king acted in a real kingly fashion. He went home and went to bed and put his head to the wall and pouted. You know, you feel sorry for a man like that. I'll tell you who I feel sorry for. When you got a leader like that, I feel sorry for the people he's supposed to be leading. What a pathetic nation it was to have Ahab and Jezebel to be their leaders. Well, Jezebel came in and says, "What's wrong with you?" And he told her, "I didn't get my way. He didn't let me have the vineyard." Pout, pout, pout. And so she said, "Why, just give me your seal. I'll get that for you." Well, the Bible student knows what she did. She concocted a feast day and brought Naboth there to the feast day, and then had accusations made against him, false accusations to be sure, but accusations that would result in his execution for violating them. And then after a while, Naboth was dead, and she comes to Ahab and he said, "Now, you just go ahead and take your vineyard. He's dead." So he goes down to the vineyard, and who does he meet? Well, the Lord told Elijah, the prophet, to go down and meet the king there, verse 17 and 18. And he told him what to tell Ahab, verse 19 of 1 Kings 21. "And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Hast thou killed and also taken possession? And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, In the place where the dogs lick the blood of Naboth, shall the dogs lick thy blood, even thine." Now that was a strong condemnation, wasn't it? That was a prediction that certainly should have shaken him, and it did shake him to some degree, and he was very disturbed by it. But you know, I'm reminded by this one time when Moses told 2.5 tribes of Israel, "Be sure thy sins will find you out." That's what Elijah is telling Ahab right here. The dogs are going to lick your blood at the very place where Naboth was killed. Well, we move on down in the period of time, and Ahab, as I said, they were always enemies with Syria, and he wanted to recapture some of the territory that he felt the king of Syria had taken, and wasn't justified. He said, "It belongs to me, and it belongs to Israel, and they shouldn't have it, and I want it back, and I'm going up against him." And so he asked Jehoshaphat, who was the king of southern Judah, to be his ally and to go with him into this battle. And uncharacteristically, Jehoshaphat, who's generally looked upon as a pretty good king of southern Judah, he said, "I'll go with you. My men are your men. My horses are your horses." And he should have said, "My foolishness is your foolishness." But anyway, he didn't say that. But he said, "Yeah, I'll go with you." So they went to attack the king of Syria. Now, before they went into battle, Jehoshaphat said, "Let's let the prophets tell us about what's going to happen." And Ahab said, "Well, we've got a lot of prophets." He had a lot of prophets that always tell him just what he wanted to hear. You know, some folks are like that. And Jehoshaphat said, now wait a minute. Don't you have a prophet of the Lord around here somewhere?" He said, "Yeah, we got one, but I don't like him." "Well, why don't you like him?" "Well, he doesn't ever say anything good to me. I hate him." That's the way a lot of people are with the messengers of God. They just don't like him. Why? He tells them what God said, and he didn't want to hear what God said. He wanted to hear what his prophets would scratch and tickle his ears with. And so he was upset. And so this prophet was named Micaiah. And so they said, Jehoshaphat said, "Oh, don't be like that. Go and bring him in." So he brought in Micaiah. Before Micaiah got there, a fellow came to him and says, "Now look, Micaiah, all these prophets have told these kings that you're going in there and you're going to win, everything's going to be just fine. Don't go in there and mess this up. Don't cause a lot of trouble. Just go along with them." And so Micaiah went in, and he said, "Oh, sure, go ahead, everything's going to be fine." Well, Ahab knew Micaiah wasn't. He was spoofing him right there. He was really just going along there a little bit. And so Micaiah told him, he said, you'll not succeed, and you won't come back alive. Well, Ahab told Jehoshaphat, said, see, I told you what he would do. I knew he would say something bad about me. And there was a false prophet there that slapped Micaiah across the face while he was talking. But nonetheless, Ahab says, put him in prison, and when I'll get back, I'll take care of him. Micaiah said, if you get back, God hadn't told me what to say. Well, that made it pretty final, didn't it? So Ahab, he decided, I'll get around this. I'll disguise myself as, not as a king, but just as a typical soldier. So nobody will know who I am, because you see, the king of Syria had already told his men, now our real enemy is the king of Israel, Ahab. And let's get Ahab. He's the man that we want to get. So they went into battle. And of course, Jehoshaphat, he was in his kingly chariot. And the men started after the kingly chariot, and they thought that was the king Ahab. And Jehoshaphat said, woe back, I'm not who you want. I'm not the one. Just don't get me. And so they left off Jehoshaphat. And it looked like Ahab was going to get away, that he wasn't going to be hurt, that he had going to outwit God, and he was going to show that the prophet Micaiah was wrong because he was disguised. Now watch what happens. There was a soldier in the Syrian army. Who was he? Only the Lord knows. What did he do? He took his bow and arrow and he let loose. What was he aiming at? Israelites, that's all. Wasn't it Shakespeare that said, I shot an arrow into the air, it fell to earth, I know not where? Huh? Longfellow? Okay. Whoever. But I got a little different twist on that. I said, I shot an arrow into the air, it came to earth, and I know where. It swapped right down between the harness there of Ahab's armor. You know, he thought he was going to get away. He didn't get away, did he? He fell in his chariot, and as he was being taken back to the city, he died. And later on, they washed out his chariot where Naboth had been killed, and the dogs came and licked the blood of Ahab. What did Elijah tell him was going to happen? Just exactly that. Ahab thought he could get around God. You can't get around God. But now, how important was that Syrian soldier? He didn't even know who he hit, probably. And he didn't get any headlines. He was a very insignificant sort of a person. And an arrow? What's an arrow in weaponry, even though they had their shields and their spears and their bows and arrows and all that? An arrow is just a very insignificant little weapon in all the paraphernalia that they had, wasn't it? Look how the Lord used that insignificant man. Look how the Lord used that insignificant arrow. Was that luck? That wasn't luck. Almighty God guided that arrow to the fulfillment of what his prophet had said was going to take place. Small things used by the Lord to accomplish the things that God intended to accomplish. I think we can see that from this, can we not? In the death of Ahab. And I know I'm not going to have time to tell about the death of Jezebel. I will next week, Lord willing, if we're here. But there's that's another one. Oh, that's a daily. But now we do have time to turn to one more. And we'll turn to the New Testament. And let's look at Luke chapter 5 And we'll begin reading with verse 17. Luke chapter 5, verse 17. And it came to pass on a certain day that as he, Christ, was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by, which were come out of every town in Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. And behold, men brought in a bed a man which was taken with a palsy, and they sought means to bring him in, and to lay him before him, to lay the palsied man before Christ. And when they could not find by what way they might bring him in because of the multitude, notice how thoughtful they were. They went upon the housetop and let him down through the tiling with his couch into the midst before Jesus. And when he saw their faith, I want you to notice, I'm going to pause right there and look at that. Faith is an intangible spiritual quality, isn't it? But he saw this invisible, intangible spiritual quality. How did he see their faith? He saw their faith by what their faith caused them to do. Folks, we're saved by faith. We're saved by a faith that causes us to do what the Lord tells us to do. It's not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, that shall enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said, why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Luke 6:46. He saw their faith. He saw them doing what they truly believed. And they let him down. Verse 20, and he told the man, and the man was sick now, but notice what he tends to first. Man, thy sins are forgiven thee. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, who is this which speaketh blasphemous? Who can forgive sins but God alone? And when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answering said unto them, what reason ye in your hearts? Whether it is easy to say, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, rise up and walk. But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power upon earth to forgive sins, he saith unto the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, and take up thy couch, and go into thine house. And immediately he rose up before them, and took up that whereon he lay, and departed to his own house, glorifying God. And they were all amazed, and glorified God, and were filled with fear, saying, we have seen strange things today. They had not seen anything like that before, that's to be sure. But now, I want you to notice these men. The man that was sick of palsy, we don't know who he was, but he must have had confidence that Jesus Christ could help him. And he allowed these men to help him. But I want to really focus my attention on these men. There must have been at least 4 of them to carry him on this couch. And to think that they couldn't get through the doorway, just a multitude of people there, you can understand how that situation would develop. But they didn't quit. Notice how significant they were. And notice the important thing that they did. Now, to get to the top of a house in Palestine, you'd have outside stairways, and they would generally be flat. Rainfall was such as would allow that kind of construction. And they took off the roof and let the man down, obviously with ropes or whatever, and let him down right into the presence of Jesus Christ. You know what I know about those men? Those men cared for that sick man. They were compassionate for that sick man. They wanted to help that sick man. But more important than that, they believed that Jesus Christ could help this sick man. And Christ saw their faith. These were not important men. Their names are not even given. We don't know who they were. but how significant they were. Small people? Well, probably. Not large enough to command a lot about them, but you can see a lot about them that was so outstanding and admirable, can you not? Despise not the day of small people. And they were small people. And the deed that they did, rather unusual deed. How important was their work? Notice what happened. It caused people to glorify God. Is that important? I suggest when anybody does something that causes people to glorify God, that's important. He said, we never saw it like this before. They realized this man here is special. And he's doing things that nobody has ever done before. And those were the kind of things that Jesus used to prove and confirm his identity as being God in the flesh. And these men assisted him in this particular situation to be able to accomplish that. You know, what they did was a tremendous accomplishment that day. And they contributed to it. And they were important for doing so. And I think they are to be blessed and praised for what they had done. And that we can look upon them as being among the outstanding people of the New Testament.